Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A short address to the House. I think, though, that this bill is worthy of greater analysis than that, and I know that my Labour colleagues have been contributing to the debate and this discussion, because if we look at the wider context around victims' rights in the criminal justice system, there is still so much more that could be achieved. They are contentious areas, though, and I think this is the place and an opportunity for us to explore some of those issues that arise out of the fact, for instance, that we have an adversarial justice system and all of the issues that brings up for a victim, the fact that our provocation laws have not, the repeal of those haven't truly allowed us to protect families from re-victimisation and so on. So those are some of the issues that I hope to touch on briefly in my short address, Mr. Speaker. I want to, though, first discuss the context in which we are debating this legislation, which is obviously focused on victims. But let's look at the context in which victims today in New Zealand find themselves in. We're often reliant on our crime statistics to make a judgment on whether or not there are more victims out there this year than there was last year, for instance. Now, if you ask the Minister of Justice or indeed the Minister of Police, they will tell you crime's down, and therefore the great assumption that's left hanging is that the number of victims has reduced. The issue with our crime statistics, and this has always been an issue, not a new one, is that they are totally reliant on individuals reporting a crime to the police then recording that crime, and then it therefore being released in our statistics. Now, first flaw in that system is that it relies on an individual feeling like they get something out of calling the police in order to motivate them to do that. Now, you might argue that in property offences they would do it then because they might have an insurance claim hanging off whether or not they filed a police report. If you're poor, you are less likely to have insurance. Crass as it sounds, it's the truth. Who are our constantly re-victimised victims? Often our poorer communities. Who are therefore the people who are sometimes least well served by our criminal justice system? Those same communities. Who sometimes have a suspicion of the police, therefore, if they feel less well served. And so it continues, and therefore we have to remain with a healthy scepticism over our crime statistics, Mr. Chair. It's just a fact of life, and it is borne out by additional surveys around crime experienced by New Zealanders. Now, these are slightly older statistics, but even several years ago, 33% of all offences were reported to police. 33%. That is why we have to make sure that we do keep these kind of debates in context. I'm particularly concerned about constant re-victimisation as well. We know that 6% of victims experience 54% of victimisations, particularly, Mr. Chair, our victims of domestic violence. For some reason, now the member over there keeps asking if we're voting for the bill. I'm sorry if he thinks that the only place that we have, role we have in this House is to stand up and say we're in favour and sit down again. I think there is place for healthy debate and discussion. I'm sorry if the National Party has given up on that tonight. When it comes to domestic, this is the fourth speech from a Labour speaker, and of course all of us have said we're voting for it. Mr. Chair, when it comes to domestic violence in particular, I'm particularly concerned because for some reason in New Zealand, we tend to track higher when it comes to repeat victimisations than almost any other country. Someone who is a victim of domestic violence is likely to be re-victimised over and over again. Now, that should direct us to some of the kinds of interventions that we should be looking at in that space. So, Mr. Speaker, that's the context. So when we come to look at mechanisms to support victims, I think we should think about some of those issues, particularly re-victimisation. And one of the issues that I think Andrew Little in particular, I'm sure, will have raised, because he raised it at Select Committee in his minority report, was whether or not it's time we looked at the notion of a formal statutory position of an advocate for the victim in our court process. And that's a way of trying to address the imbalance that's created by our adversarial court system, but actually it's a really pragmatic idea as well. I remember when I was quite young, for one reason or another, I was brought in to support a victim for a day through the court system. And I remember how complex the process was, how nervous she was about what might happen in proceedings, whether or not she would see the offender, how she was meant to react at certain points in the process. Lots of questions, of course, that I didn't have the answer to. It never seemed like anyone that was involved in the court process at that time had the time or the space or the capacity to answer those questions. And so I can really, at a practical level, see a role in our justice system for that kind of position. But I think it would also help explain the process and the legal rights around victim statements. This has been a particularly controversial part of this debate. Most victims, I would think that if they were writing a victim impact statement, that it's just that. They write down the impact a crime has had on them. Why should that be edited or vetted? It's their view, it's their emotional experience that they're wanting to convey, and yet there are limitations. And being really clear about that up front, perhaps that's a way of easing that process by having someone who is obviously on your side, helping you navigate through that part of the process. I also mentioned the importance of the repeal of the partial defence of provocation. I'm really pleased that that happened in the last Parliament, I think it was. We had some really clear cases where we saw that victims were re-victimised through the court process by an offender trying to claim that they were somehow provoked into their heinous crime. But it still appears to be happening in our court system. And I think the case has been made clearly by Labour that there is still some reform required in this area, and sending a reference to the Law Commission on this point might be one way to continue on that work. So those are some of the additional issues we wanted to raise. And I think it's right that Labour raised them. We've got a proud history when it comes to enhancing victims' rights. As much as the government and the National Party would like to recharacterise the law and order space, it was things like the Victims of Offences Act and the Victims' Rights Act in 2002. I vividly remember that act. I was working for a time in Phil Goff's office when he was Minister of Justice. Not only was he working through reform around sentencing, critical reform around parole, but also high on his priority list was enhancing victims' rights. That's when we started to see embedded into legislation the ideas around, well, of course, things like the Victims' Charter that came out of that, but also really putting victim support on a firm footing to be the recognised agency in working with our victims. And I know that those working in our justice system, our police force, for instance, they absolutely value the role that victim support can play locally. One final point, I couldn't speak on this bill without making a note, Mr. Speaker, that surely our ultimate goal has always got to be preventing victims from becoming victims in the first place, decent prevention. Now, the police, the New Zealand Police have been running for some time an agenda around prevention first. That's what their focus has been. Unfortunately, the last budget produced by this government has severely undermined their ability to do decent preventative work. We've seen over $40 million cut out of the police budget, and it's their operational budget. So it's literally money that is coming out of road policing, out of prevention services, even around some of the youth services that are focused on capturing young people in their community before they start entering into the harder end of offending, and using programs that I've seen make a real difference in communities. All of those areas are going to take a hit under the last budget. So if we really want to have a focus on victims, we must maintain a focus on preventing the people who are being victimised in the first place from being in that situation, removing the tools of our justice system, of our frontline workers, to do that job properly and adequately, based on crime stats alone, when there are obvious flaws in that, I think is very flawed thinking, Mr. Speaker.
I call Paul Goldsmith.
Mr. Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
call Carol Beaumont.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is a pleasure to rise.